Sawat. Good morning. And it's a great privilege for me to meet so many principals today. You are the engineers of Thailand's future. Your schools today are going to be the economy of Thailand tomorrow. And it's not just the economy. We also see with our data that knowledge and skills are not just a predictor for employment and better wages, but also for important social outcomes, including trust in our societies. But the world is changing fast, and it is so much easier to educate children for our past than for their own future. If you think about it, about 10 years ago, we got the world's knowledge right at our fingertips. A few years later, the virtual world and the real world began to sort of merge, and now we're all connected. But many things that were very simple in the past have become very complicated. Think about teaching reading, literacy. In the past, literacy was about extracting knowledge from books, reading sequential text. That was easy to teach. And when you didn't know the answer to a question, you could look it up in an encyclopedia, and you could trust the answer to be true. Today, you look up information on Google, and you find 100,000 answers to your question. And nobody tells you what is right and what is wrong, what is true and what is not true. Literacy has become about navigating ambiguity, managing complexity, constructing knowledge. And also, I just said we're all connected. That's so easy. But in fact, what the social media around us do is they connect us with people who are like us, who think like us, who work like us, who look like us. It's actually become more difficult for people to connect with people who are different from us, to think differently. So many things that used to be easy have become complicated. And when you think about some of the data, we ask 15-year-olds in our PISA test how they relate to technology. And you can see that the majority of 15-year-olds in Thailand say they feel really bad if they're not connected. Basically, being connected has become like drinking water or breathing air. It's sort of a natural life of people. And we've seen a huge increase in the time that young people spend online. The yellow dot is about 2012, the blue bar is about 2015, and you can see in some countries the time young people spend online out of a school day has almost doubled in just 3 years. Basically, the technological world, the virtual world, has become the real world for young people. That's the world for which we need to educate children these days. When you think about digitalization around us, it's an incredibly democratizing force. Everybody can participate, everybody can collaborate. But it's also concentrating power at a rate that we have never seen before. It's incredibly particularizing. The smallest voice can be heard everywhere. You post something on Twitter and everybody can listen to you. But it's also incredibly homogenizing, squashing individuality, cultural uniqueness. Technology is incredibly empowering. And you can see this right here in Bangkok. People with a great idea can change the world today. And across the globe, the biggest companies that we created in the last 10 years all started with an idea. They had the product before they had the resources. But also technology can become very disempowering for us. Sometimes we become the slaves of algorithms that tell us whether to turn right or to turn left, and we trust those algorithms sometimes more than we trust ourselves. And where we end up on this chart has a lot to do with our knowledge and skills. I want to talk about the effects of digitalization and then also look at the skills that we need for this. First of all, we know that the world of work is dramatically changing because of technology. What we see is that there has been a shift from routine tasks to non-routine tasks. The kind of things that are easy to teach, easy to test, have also become easy to digitize, to automate. The world no longer rewards us just for what we know, but for what we can do with what we know. And we see an increase in the tasks that are technology intensive. And you put the two things together, this is the world of work of tomorrow. A world that requires a lot more complexity and the capacity of people to navigate complexity. Let's see how well people are prepared for this. Now, I don't have so many countries on this chart, but when I look at the older generation, the capacity of people to manage technology, you can see only about 1 in 10 older workers are prepared for the technology world. Now you tell me, well, this is about older workers. The younger people are all digital natives. They grow up in this technology-rich world. They can all use technology, they can think technology. But in fact, it looks different. Yes, young people are better prepared for the technological world. But actually, only about 1 in 2 people in the most industrialized nations have the cognitive, social, emotional skills to deal with technology, to solve problems in a technological world. And you can see how this has changed. In the past, the United States was ahead of everyone else, except, New Zealand here. But when I look today, the United States is almost at the bottom of the list. Not because skills deteriorated in the United States, but because so many other countries have moved faster on this. If you look to Singapore at the top, in the past only very few people were prepared for the world of today. Today, many young people graduate with actually advanced skills. But even in Singapore, the number 1, you have still 1/3 of young people who are unprepared in terms of their problem-solving skills for this world. So there's a lot to do in education to educate people for tomorrow's world. Now, some people have called this a race between technology and education. Before the big industrial revolution, neither education nor technology had a great importance for the most of us in the lives. But then came the industrial revolution, moving technology ahead of people. And it left lots of people in big social pain because people were not prepared for this. But of course, that was the time when we invented universal public schooling, making people compliant with the ideas and norms of the industrial society, and that created huge amounts of wealth among people. But today we see the digital revolution changing this once again, moving technology once more ahead of the skills of people. And already now, we can see university graduates having difficulties finding jobs in some cases. And at the same time, employers telling us they cannot find the people with the skills they need. We need to move people ahead of the technology of our times once again. That's the challenge of our times. And we have been thinking about this for many years at the OECD. What are the knowledge and skills for the future? If I start with knowledge, of course, content knowledge is always important. To know the fundamentals of a disciplines. But actually what's becoming more important these days is what we call epistemic understanding. Yes, it matters what you know in physics, chemistry, and biology, but that is changing very fast. Tomorrow it will be something different. What remains is your capacity to think like a scientist, to understand the basic ideas and concepts of science, to know how to design an experiment, to understand what questions are scientifically investigable and distinguish them from those that are not. to think like a mathematician, not to know a lot of formulas and equations, but to understand how we can use mathematics to model the world. History is not about names and places and dates. It's about understanding how the narrative of a society has evolved, emerged, developed, and sometimes unravels when the context changes. And what that means for our times today. That is about thinking like an historian. So a shift from content knowledge to epistemic understanding. But knowledge is only the start. Our capacity to use knowledge creatively is at the premium today. And this, when you think about this, the first thing that comes to your mind are cognitive skills, creativity, critical thinking, and they're very, very important. But equally important are the social and emotional skills of people. In fact, when we look at the evolution of labor demand in the industrial world, the biggest rise in skills these days is in the social skills, the capacity of people to collaborate, compete, and connect. And in our schools, we often put students behind individual desks, no? And at the end of the year, we give them a test where they have to show that they are better than their neighbor. It's not the way to develop social skills for the 21st century. No? And last but not least, attitudes and values. This is where things get really difficult, sometimes controversial. But what is clear is that the world of tomorrow is no longer just about teaching something, but it's about helping people develop a reliable compass and the navigation skills to find their own way through this world that is becoming increasingly complex, ambiguous, volatile, and so on. This is what competency is about, mobilizing our cognitive, social, and emotional resources to do something. There are 3 competencies that are particularly important. The first is about our creative, our innovative capacity. Artificial intelligence these days pushes us to think much harder what makes us truly human. Now, and artificial intelligence is very, very good in extrapolating from the past, understanding all of what we know today and thinking what this means for the future. But to think around the next corner, to create something of intrinsic positive worth, that is a truly human capacity. Developing this is very, very important. Managing tensions and dilemmas. The world is no longer black and white. Often we need to navigate ambiguity, deal with uncertainty. It's not necessarily that every question has a single answer. There are sometimes multiple answers. We need to learn to think in terms of alternatives. And last but not least, taking responsibility, taking action. When you think about what this means for pedagogy, I want to put openness at the start, our capacity to anticipate. And I'm saying this because in school we are often very good in teaching the next generation our wisdom. But it's equally important, and perhaps more important these days, to have young people who can question the established wisdom of our times, who can basically put things to the test, to see the emergence of new paradigms. I know in school you deal with learning, and that's very important. But equally important this day, it is to be able to unlearn and to relearn when the context changes. To give up some of our beliefs and ideas that we have grown very comfortable with when the context changes and we need to adapt to new kinds of ways of thinking. Anticipation, reflection, being able to step back, to see the bigger picture, to see the forest among the trees. Very important. And last but not least, putting all of those into action. Now, this is all easy to say, really hard to do. And I want to show you one of the education systems that always comes out very well on international comparisons like PISA is Canada, the province of Ontario. And you can see here, they have done a lot of work to embed critical thinking into their curriculum in many of the subject areas. And the same for communication skills, and the same for problem-solving skills. But when I move on to look to social skills, collaboration, that is not present in the Ontario curriculum. So yes, some of the domains of the future are very well embedded in those schools, but others are not. If I compare this with Japan, another very strong performing education system. Remember, the Canadians put a lot of emphasis on critical thinking? That is not present in the Japanese case, or very little of that. But the Japanese are doing very well on collaborative skills, because the school is very much built around social skills. But I look at entrepreneurship at the end, the capacity of students to take initiative, to do something new. That is not present in the Japanese case. And I could show you lots of education systems here, but the story is very simple. Some of the things we are able to do today, but there are a lot of gaps in our education system. And to be honest, the gap between what our societies need and what schools provide is not becoming smaller in most countries. It's actually becoming wider. Lots of things for us to do. So, before I talk about what makes education succeed, I want to actually help you debunk some of the misunderstandings that often prevent us from changing education. The first thing that we often think is that poverty is destiny. And you can see here on this chart, on the horizontal axis, the socioeconomic context of schools, and on the vertical axis, the quality of schools, in the case of Thailand. Every dot is one school. The bigger dots are the bigger dots schools, the smaller dots are the smaller schools, and so on. And what you can see is, as you move from poorer to wealthier neighborhoods, you get better schooling outcomes. That's the first thing that we can see, that actually the quality of learning depends on the social context of schooling. But you also see there are lots of exceptions. Sometimes there are schools in similar social contexts with very different learning outcomes. Tells us actually poverty is not destiny. And I want to, have a look at the chart that you can see here, and I compare this with Vietnam. What do you see? Vietnam is actually poorer in the socioeconomic context than Thailand is now, of the schools. But if you compare that, go back to Thailand, look at Vietnam, schools in similar social contexts in Vietnam do a lot better. And this tells us that poverty need not be destiny. It's a big challenge for schools in disadvantaged areas to produce good results. But some education systems have become very good to attract high-quality teachers even into the most disadvantaged schools, and to deliver excellent teaching for every student. This is a challenge, but it shows us it's possible. And if I actually do that across countries, here I map the learning outcomes by decile of social background. And you can see in some countries the most disadvantaged students do better than the students from the wealthiest families in other countries. So, it tells us we need to work harder to make education excellent for everyone. And one of the things that we see is that often it's to do with equity and opportunities. What you can see on this chart here is that as a tendency, we make classes smaller in disadvantaged areas. We give actually often poorer schools more teachers. That looks great. That it's an effort to make education more equitable. But when I look at the quality of teachers, it turns exactly the opposite way around. When I look at the quality of teachers, you can see in poor schools, it's a lot lower than in wealthy schools. So yes, we put more resources into poorer schools sometimes, but we don't put the better resources into the disadvantaged schools. And one of the hallmarks of high-performing education systems is their capacity to attract the most talented teachers into the most challenging environments. A lot of things that we can do better. Poverty need not be destiny. No? We also sometimes sort of say, well, immigration is a source of problems in our schools. They drag overall performance down. But what our data show is that the country where students go to school is much more influential on the success of students than the country where students come from. Money. Actually, Tawan has already shown you this chart. No? Money is part of the success. No? I do believe that Thailand should invest more in its education, in its schools. But it only improves education up to a point. At some point, you need to think harder about how to prioritize resources. No? If you have to spend, 1,000 baht more, are you going to use it to pay your teachers more? Or to build more attractive careers for teachers? Or to give students more learning time? Or to give teachers more time for professional development? No? Those are very difficult choices. And the choices are as important as the volume of money that you spend. Time. Some people say, well, we want to do more, but we don't have enough time in school. And you can see there's a lot of difference in the learning time that students have. In blue, you can see the time in school. In yellow, the time that students learn out of school. Private tutoring and homework, lots of things. And you can look, the United Arab Emirates, number 1. Students learn 60 hours per week. On the left side, you can see Finland. Students only learn about half of that time per week, 35 hours. No? Huge differences in the quantity of learning time. But when I look at the learning outcomes, the productivity in the system, how much do students learn per hour of instruction? I can show you in Finland or in Germany or in Switzerland or Japan. Students learn a lot in very little time. Whereas in the United Arab Emirates, students spend a lot of time and learn very little. Raising productivity is the challenge of our times, not just little time. And you can see it's very similar in Thailand. The challenge is really raising learning gains per hour of instruction, not just adding more hours of student learning time. So, success is about more than money and time, very important as well. How we spend our resources. Here's something interesting. Here I show you on the vertical axis the student-teacher ratio, how generous our education systems with teacher supply. And on the horizontal axis, I show you the size of classes. And you can see they're not the same thing. You can see the United States on the left side, very generous with its teachers, and they put all of their effort in making classes very small. And I compare that with China. The student-staff ratio is almost exactly as it is in the United States. But the Chinese have very large classes. And now you might say, well, the Americans are much smarter. They use their teachers to make classes smaller. But actually, that comes at a price. American teachers have no time for anything else than teaching because they have so small classes. They have to run from 1 hour to the next. The Chinese teachers teach only about half of what the American teachers teach. And they have lots of time to work with individual students, to work with parents, to work with other teachers, to develop themselves, to invest in their own professional development. And actually, if you look at this chart carefully, you can see that most high-performing education systems, whenever they have to make a choice between a smaller class and a better teacher, they invest in the better teacher. Now, Thailand is sort of in the middle of the two. No? And the question is, where is Thailand going to move? More to the United States, emphasizing quantity, or more to China, emphasizing quality? Those are really big questions to answer. No? Now, some people say maybe smaller classes are not so efficient, but smaller classes are going to make teachers happy. Actually, you're going to be surprised. We tested that. We looked at teacher job satisfaction and the size of the classes which they teach. And we could not find any relationship between the job satisfaction of teachers and the size of the class they teach. When we ask ourselves what makes teachers happy, satisfied with their work environment, it was all about professionalization. Professionalization was even more important than the teacher's salary, certainly more than the size of the classes. And when I talk about professionalization, this is about professional autonomy. This is about professional knowledge. This is about a collaborative culture in the teaching profession. That's about you as principals. The environment which you provide for your teachers to grow in their careers is the #1 factor that predicts teacher job satisfaction. It also predicts teacher self-efficacy and even the status of the teaching profession. So as principals, you hold the key to improving teacher job satisfaction and by implication teacher quality. It's not about hiring more teachers. It's not about just paying teachers more. It is about creating an environment of true professionalization. I sort of talked about some of the factors that actually are very deceptive, that often mislead us to invest in our resources in things that are not so important. So let's turn to the things that really make a difference. The first thing is about making education a priority. That is the biggest kind of determinant. And this is easy to say, hard to do. Would you want your child to become a teacher or a lawyer? How much resources is a society willing to invest in its education today? Many questions in our societies is about the trade-off between our future and our present. Chinese parents are investing the last resources into the education of their children, which is their future, and the government as well. In many other parts of the world, we have already spent the money of our children for our own consumption and are heavily indebted. That choice is critically important, and it's also reflected in the status, in the social status of teachers. If you go to Singapore, if you go to Korea, if you go to Finland, teachers see their job valued by society. In other countries, the respect that teachers feel is much more limited. And now you can say, well, that's just teachers' views and opinions, but actually it's a powerful predictor of the level of excellence that we see in education. The greater the social status of teachers, the higher the performance of systems. And again, this is not just about money. That's also how you, as principals, actually define the environment for teachers and the respect they have in society. A belief that every student can learn. That's what equity really is about. Now, in the past, we gave every student the same learning conditions. Now, that's our strive towards equality. But it's not enough. We need to really shift from equality to equity, to align resources with the needs, understanding that different students learn differently, and embracing that diversity with differentiated pedagogical practice. And ultimately, it's about fairness, removing the obstacles that stand behind achieving equity, giving every child the opportunity to fully participate. Huge challenge. That is basically our objective. Having high expectations. This is about rigor. Expecting every student to succeed well. Activating. Cognitive activation is the key here. Teaching fewer things at greater depth. Some people say students in Thailand don't do so well on PISA because they don't learn so many things. Actually, the amount of things that students in Thailand learn is larger than in many high-performing systems. Teaching fewer things at greater depth is often the key to success. It's much harder to do. It's about remaining true to the disciplines, but also to encourage interdisciplinary understanding. Innovation today is no longer about you being very good in a single discipline, but it's about you being able to connect the dots, to think about problems from multiple disciplinary perspectives. Cross-curricular learning has become very, very important these days. Balancing knowledge of the disciplines with knowledge about the disciplines. Focusing on areas with the highest transfer value, basically, that enables students to extrapolate from what they know and use and apply their knowledge in a novel situation. If you ask me what is the biggest reason for Thailand not doing so well on PISA, is that students, your students, are very good in reproducing what they have been taught. They remember that. They can actually write the correct answer. But they have often great difficulties when they need to apply their knowledge in an unfamiliar, novel setting. Some people say, well, the PISA test is unfair to students because students are tested with things that they haven't seen before. But if you think that's unfair, then life is unfair, because that's what modern life does to us. We are confronted with things we haven't seen, and we need to actually see how we use what we know to solve that. Authenticity. Having learning that reflects real-world situations, the complex reality. And also remember that some things are caught, not taught, particularly when we talk about social-emotional skills, character qualities. And clearly nowhere does the quality of education exceed the quality of teachers. Technology is great in education, but actually the heart of education is teaching. Learning is always a social phenomenon, a relational process. And actually, when you think about this, there are three things that are important. First of all is the knowledge that teachers have. The first thing your students find out is whether you as a teacher are really deeply embedded in your subject, whether you deeply understand your subject, and whether you have a passion for your subject. It's knowledge about the discipline. It's knowledge about how students learn in that discipline. It's knowledge about how your students learn. And it's knowledge about your students. Do you, as a teacher, actually relate to your individual students? We test that in PISA, and we can find it's a big predictor for success. So the foundations, the knowledge. The second thing that is very important is what we call professional autonomy. What discretion do you as principals give your teachers to design innovative learning environments, to empower them to create new kind of instructional context, to create what their students need in the specific context? And professional autonomy is not about, I do what I like. Professional autonomy is, I do what I know is right in the name of my profession. Having that kind of ownership of professional practice, that deep understanding, that is what professional autonomy is about. But even that is not enough. The collaborative culture is important. What opportunities do teachers have to work together to frame good practice, to learn from each other, to learn with each other? Let me just give you an example. When we look at this, we can see that teachers often work together in a very social way. They share materials, they actually do team conferences. There's a lot of activities that teachers do together. That looks great. But if you actually look at the deeper layers of professional collaboration, team teaching, collaborative professional development, joint activities, classroom observation, you can see they are very rare. Teachers have very few opportunities to join other teachers in their teaching efforts, to work together to frame good practice. It's actually rare. And when you actually see what this matters, you can see the more teachers teach jointly as a class, the more they observe other teachers' classes, the more they engage in joint activities, the more they take part in collaborative professional development, the greater their sense of ownership and self-efficacy. So the environment you provide in your schools for deep professional collaboration are one of the strongest predictors for the effectiveness of teaching. And we see it's often superficial, but not deep enough to actually change this. And we can sort of see it varies a lot across countries. Now, countries like Estonia and Singapore have a deep culture of professional collaboration. Shanghai in China is also very good at this. In other countries, is more limited. It's one of the challenges of our time. Teaching is often still a very isolating profession. Teachers have a lot of responsibilities, but they sit alone in their classroom facing very difficult challenges. True professions are all linked. They are integrated. They work together to develop new practice. And it's also about, changing teacher beliefs. I don't have data for Thailand on this chart, but I want to show you something. When we surveyed British teachers about what their pedagogical beliefs are, you could see almost all of British teachers say, my role as a teacher is to facilitate students' own inquiry, or students learn best by finding solutions on their own. Thinking and reasoning is more important than curriculum content. And now you can say, wow, these are very innovative, very creative teachers. But the question is, do British teachers do what they say? Often there is a gap between the ideas of teachers and the reality in the classroom. If British teachers do what you see on the screen, they would not use memorization. They would use complex elaboration strategies in education. But when we look at the data, actually there is no country among the ones for which we have data that uses more simple memorization than the United Kingdom. Had I asked you at the beginning, which country uses rote learning most, you might have tipped on countries like China. But actually, they use some memorization, but not predominantly. What I'm telling you is that actually, sometimes teachers believe they do certain things, but they never challenge themselves. Are they really doing this? And if you believe you do the right thing, but in reality, it's not what you do, then you will never change your practice. That's why it is so important for you as principals to give teachers opportunities to see their own practice, to get the mirror, to work together, to observe each other's classrooms. Otherwise, you end up with this gap between intended and implemented practices. Why is this important? Well, let me bring you once more to the PISA data. Here I show you how helpful memorization strategies are to solve PISA tasks. And I order the PISA tasks from simple to more complex. This is about mathematics. And what you can say is for relatively simple tasks, memorization is okay. You can remember a number, a formula, a product. But as the tasks get more complex, your probability of solving them rightly with memorization skills is actually steeply declining. Memorization will actually hinder you from finding answers to complex mathematical problems. You think there's a right answer, you don't remember it, you don't think that the problem requires a different approach. And why is this so important? Because the world is moving from the left to the right side. Now, the simple things, machines and computers and telephones are much better than we are. On the right side, solving complex problems, that is a human capacity. And memorization doesn't help us. And it's a big challenge for your country as well. Thailand is also one of the countries where memorization as a learning strategy is heavily dominating. It's good for simple tasks. As the world moves, it will make it harder and harder. What you really need are those elaboration strategies. To solve the most complex problems, students need to be able to connect what they know with what they do not know. They need to be able to extrapolate. They need to master those new types of learning strategies. And they're much harder to teach. It's easy to teach students a piece of content. It's much harder to teach them the thinking skills. But those thinking skills are the ones that students require to solve the most complex problems of our times. That's where we are facing huge challenges to change the teaching profession. What's also important is to create more space and room for innovation. We ask teachers to what extent they see that the environment rewards and recognizes innovation. And we can see it's only about 1/4 of the teachers who think that innovation, being more innovative in their practice, is going to be recognized. It's going to be rewarded by the system. The majority of teachers perceive the environment as hostile to innovation. If we cannot change that perception, it's going to be very hard to change reality. So aligning incentives is very, very important. And last but not least, it's about leadership. School leadership, system leadership, your role. And it is really hard because education, particularly schools, are incredibly conservative social systems. And we as parents are often part of the problem. Now, we get very nervous when our children learn things that we did not learn when we were young. No? And we get even more anxious when our children no longer learn things that we felt was so important for our lives. So we try to hold education back, to keep education where it was. No? Teachers are more likely to teach how they were taught themselves than how they were taught to teach. And, as educational leaders, policymakers can lose an election over education when people are unhappy, but they never win an election over education because it takes so much time to implement good ideas, much more than an election cycle. So our education systems are very conservative social systems. They rarely change. And that's why your role as school leaders, being true leaders, is so important. To challenge the complacency that we see in our education systems, to be aware of what is necessary, and to create the conditions in which your teacher can truly innovate and drive education forward. How do we make this happen? The first thing is really about understanding what makes change in education so difficult. Challenging the status quo every day. How can we do things differently? Where can we actually break the kind of barriers that we see around us? It's also about building really a robust consensus, where we do not involve teachers and school leaders in the design of educational reform. They will rarely help with implementation. We are done as humans like this. Being included in the process of leadership and design is very, very important. Building a strong professional understanding is very important. Often the things that we talk about in education, the size of classes, the money, the structures, the processes, this is just a small tip of a huge iceberg. And most of that iceberg is actually under the waterline. We never see it. This is about the motivations of people, the fears of people, the anxieties of people, the interests of people. Understanding those dimensions well will help us to actually implement change. It's very, very important. We also sort of think it's very important to be able to steer the system, to set direction, to see the bigger picture, to see the future. You as teachers, your students will not necessarily be able to look as far as you as a school leader can. Basically, setting the direction is very, very important. And then to give change time. Many of the things that we do in education really take a long time. And last but not least, being able to look outwards, challenge yourself. Actually, this is always hard to do. We always see unfamiliar things, strange things. But actually, it's one of the big determinants of successful education systems, that they constantly look outwards. This is not about copying and pasting things from elsewhere. It's about understanding what makes schools succeed and then trying to translate those factors into our own context. As I showed you at the beginning, you can look to Thailand. In a similar social environment, you can see some schools doing so much better than others. How can we learn from them? How can we learn with them? How can we build a community of change by looking outwards? That is the challenge. And the same for education systems. It's not about copying and pasting, it's about understanding how things really work. What I want to say in conclusion is that the challenges are tough. There is no question about this. The agenda for education is a very, very difficult one, and it is an uphill struggle because the environment around ourselves is getting more demanding, is getting more complex every day. The world is changing much faster than our school systems. But we also have many good examples of success. Good examples in the world, some education systems that have improved dramatically over the last decade. In your neighborhood, Vietnam is a great example for that. Some schools that succeed despite difficult conditions. In Thailand, you have many outstanding schools, many outstanding teachers. The challenge is often not to, push new practice from up into the education system. The challenge is more about finding the good practices in Thailand's education system today, the great teachers, the innovative ideas, finding them, scaling them, and bringing them into the education systems. Using your school systems as a big learning community. There's a lot we can learn to build better schools from what we know today. Quality, equity, and efficiency are big paradigms, but they are achievable goals. It is entirely today within our means to ensure that every student gets an excellent education. Thank you very much.